Hello all, welcome to another GNSI Author Spotlight episode from the Global National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I am Arman Mahmoudian, an adjunct faculty of USF through the GNSI College of Honor and a researcher at the Global National Security Institute. Today, I have the pleasure of having an interview with Dr. Vali Nasr. Dr. Vali Nasr is a professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at John Hopkins University. In addition, he's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. Dr. Vali Nasr is a prominent and well-known Iranian scholar on Iranian affairs. He has authored many books on Iran and international affairs, including The Dispensable Nation, U.S. Foreign Policy in Retreat, and the Shia Revival, How Conflicts Within Islam Would Force the Future of the Middle East. But we are today here to discuss his latest work with his colleagues and peers, How Sanctions Work, Iran, and the Impact of Economic Warfare. Dr. Nasr, it's a great pleasure to have you on our shows. Thank you very much for coming. I want to begin this discussion with a spoiler question. Do sanctions work?
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very grateful to GNSI and to this opportunity to discuss this work. The simple answer is that, yes, sanctions work in a very narrow sense, in a way that, like you would say, a scalpel works or an instrument works. So yes, it does put enormous amount of pressure on a country's economy. It can disrupt its trade, its relationship with the world. It can limit its access to international financial institutions, and it does impact the country's economic performance. So it's a very powerful tool. But if by sanctions work, we mean, does it reach its objectives? I think what we find in this book is that it does not. In other words, if we look at the case of Iran, which is until recently, when Russia was sanctioned because of the Ukraine war, it has been the most sanctioned country in the world. It has been sanctioned longest at this pace, literally going back over 4 decades to the Iranian Revolution. And then since 2020, when President Trump 2018, when he came out of the nuclear deal and imposed maximum pressure sanctions, it has been subject to probably the most severe sanctions regime that we have seen. So there's a lot to look at in the case of Iran. And then we basically say, has sanctions actually produced what they intended? And the answer is no. So did the sanctions change Iran's behavior in the Middle East, in the region? The answer, even if we looked at the Gaza war today, look at Iran's confrontation with the United States, look at Houthis, look at Hezbollah, the answer has to be no, has not. Has it impacted Iran's ability to be able to finance, train, and build its Middle East proxies? The answer is no. These proxies have become closer to Iran. Their capabilities have become more lethal and more aggressive. Has Iran's attitudes with its own population or attitude to with the United States changed under sanctions, especially under maximum pressure sanctions? The answer is no. We saw during the 2022 uprisings in Iran, uprisings in 2019, in 2018, we've seen that it has not changed the way in which the Islamic Republic governs. For the better or worse, there's no change in that. We also see that actually Iran became much more aggressive after maximum pressure than before. Iran attacked tankers in the Gulf, Persian Gulf. It attacked oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. It shut down a US drone. And there was an escalation cycle with Iran, which led to the killing of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, which Iran retaliated with a barrage of missiles that hit a base in Iraq. So Iran is not less aggressive with the United States as a consequence of sanctions. And the purpose of the sanctions was to halt Iran's nuclear program, to force it to the table to negotiate a new deal. There is no new deal negotiated with Iran as we are speaking, and Iran is actually far further along the path to full nuclear capability than it was before maximum pressure sanctions. So our argument in this book is not to sort of discuss whether the Islamic Republic is good or bad, or whether we agree with its policies or not, but to say that you're standing on this side. You're looking at the United States use of sanctions in order to achieve policy goals. So as effective as sanctions are, they actually have fallen short of their policy goals. And we actually go one step further in this book to say that not only sanctions have not worked as they were intended, they actually have backfired. In other words, in every one of these indices, the situation with Iran is worse based on America's own standards of what is good and bad here, is worse than it was before sanctions. Iran is more aggressive, is more powerful and daring in the region. Its nuclear program is more advanced than it was. And even domestically, there has been a total consolidation of power in the hands of the Revolutionary Guards and perhaps the most conservative element and the most anti-American element in the Iranian political establishment.
Thank you. Well, your explanation kind of opens us or brings us to one of the two major arguments against the sanctions. One of them is just what you mentioned, the effectiveness of the sanctions in accomplishing their ultimate goal, the change of the behavior of the state or the change of the state. The other argument that we have over sanctions is a kind of good old debate over the morality or ethics of debate, or the ethics of the sanctions. So we have two school of thoughts. The first one are the group of people who believed sanctions, I don't want to use the term immoral, but they believe that they don't really go well with the ethics. They believe because it targets, harms the civilians, the citizens more than the leadership. They even go further and make an argument that sanctions at some point, for instance, I believe the case of Iraq during Saddam Hussein regime is a good example of it. Enables regimes, authoritarian governments, since they do have the monopoly over the resources, they can buy out or subside loyalty. That's one group. The other school of thoughts is those who are saying that despite the fact that sanctions, they are hurting the ordinary people, but evidently they are serving the ordinary people. And the argument that they make is that in these international politics, in our world, the only alternative to sanctions in order to pressure, to convince the hostile states to change their behavior is the employment of violence, or in other words, waging war. My question is that where does this book, and more importantly, where does Dr. Vali Nasr stand in this debate?
It's a very good question, because this is at the heart of the debate. And again, we have to approach this dispassionately by looking at the evidence that Iran presents. Or in the case, there are similarities between Iran and Iraq, Iran and Russia, Iran and Venezuela, Iran and Cuba. So there is something about sanctions that's not Iran specific, right?
Yes.
So first of all, the authors of sanctions themselves refer to it as war. And it's not a war that is fought with bullets. And it's not a war that actually deploys American troops. So it's an invisible war to the American public, right? So in a way, in the view of the country that imposes sanctions, it's seen as an alternative to violence, but not in the view of the country that's receiving it.
Yes.
In their view, it is war, and therefore, as a result, it is also a slippery slope to war. So if you looked at the case of Iran, after President Trump came out of the nuclear deal, for a period, Iran essentially tried to absorb the pressure. Then President Trump came out, I believe in 2020, if I'm not wrong, and he said that I'm going to take Iran's oil exports down to zero. In other words, I'm going to tighten sanctions further. At that point, Iran actually began to push back or become more aggressive in the form of restarting in its nuclear program, month by month, enriching to 20%, rebuilding its cascade of centrifuges, reducing its collaboration with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And then Iran also became much more aggressive in attacking tankers in UAE, on the high seas in Persian Gulf. It shot down an American drone on the border of Iran and the Gulf, which I almost led President Trump to order a strike on Iran, which he famously backed down as the airplanes were sitting on the runway ready to take off. And then Iran attacked Saudi Arabia in a very brazen way, shutting down its oil production, significant portion of its oil production for a period of time, essentially putting the United States in a position, what are you going to do about it? Didn't you say at the time of President Carter that you're going to come and defend oil flow in the Persian Gulf? Didn't you say you're going to defend Saudi Arabia? Let's see if you do it. So the United States was confronted with either backing down, which has damaged its relationship with Saudi Arabia, I would say irreparably, because now the Saudis are no longer convinced that the US would ever defend them, and or to go to war. And then in Iraq, there was an escalation that led to the killing of an American contractor at an airbase. There was an American strike back at Shia militias. There was demonstrations in front of the American embassy. And then there was the killing of General Soleimani. And Iran responded to the killing of General Soleimani with a massive barrage of missiles that hit an American airbase, the largest barrage of missiles US forces have ever experienced in their history. For 48 hours, we were on the edge of war. In fact, it is that being on the edge of war that led Iran's Air Force to shoot down a civilian airliner, expecting an imminent American threat on Iran. Now, how did we get to that point? We got to that point because maximum pressure began to slide into actual war, right? Even if we went to World War II, the Japanese continuously said that the path to war and the path to Pearl Harbor was actually American oil sanctions on Japan, right? So this is actually gratifying ourselves to say that sanctions are always a substitute for war. They're not. Their impact on countries in the way in which it damages their infrastructure, destroys their societies, destroys their economies, very much like a war. And then at some points they are actually a stepping stone to war. So we should, yes, I understand. Actually, the one way in which sanctions are actually effective, going back to your first question, is if the purpose of sanctions is to make the country that imposes them feel good, make them like they're doing something without doing anything, yes, sanctions work very well. So the Russian dissident Alexander Navalny dies in Siberia. What do? We just put 200. We just sanctioned 250 people. The number looks good in New York Times, right? Doesn't mean so. To that extent, it is very easy to get gratified by sanctions. Now, the other part, and we actually go extensively into this in the book. Particularly, my colleague Narges Bajogli conducted over 90 interviews with various people from pro-regime, anti-regime, average person, bureaucrat, etc., about the impact of sanctions on their daily lives, which is sort of narrated in the book. There is the word for that we use is there is a moral hazard in using sanctions, because whatever we say, sanctions are not against the regime, not against the country. Sanctions are ultimately levied against average people. We may couch it in any way, which way we want, but end of the day, you sanction the recipient of the real force of sanctions are average Iranian. It is their standard of living that goes down. It's their purchasing power that goes down. It's their businesses that get shut down. It's their average Iranian worker that loses its job. When you look at the data from Iran, sanctions has increased inflation. That doesn't mean that there's no mismanagement in Iran, etc. But sanctions has increased inflation. It has created scarcities in the Iranian economy that has led to unemployment and shutting down of businesses. It has reduced disposable income in the hands of Iran's middle class. Particularly people who think sanctions is going to change Iran towards a democratic future, and they put their hope on the Iranian middle class, which is the one that continuously protests against the regime. That is, in 2009, in 2022, you had a very big middle class presence in these that demands individual freedoms, demands political freedoms, demands either opening the regime or changing the regime. The size of that chunk of population is getting smaller. When Iran signed the nuclear deal, Iran's president then argued that the size of Iran's middle class is going to grow by 35% over 10 years. That's going to be the impact of sanction relief, right? Instead, under President Trump to this day, 20% of Iran's middle class has fallen below the poverty line, become poorer, right?
Yeah.
So that's material to Iran. That makes a big difference. And so, end of the day, when we preach sanctions on countries, we have to know that it doesn't impact the budget of Hezbollah. It doesn't impact the elite in Iran. It doesn't impact the stability of the regime. but it impacts the very people that you claim you want to support. So when Secretary of State Pompeo stands up there and say, we are with the people of Iran, but at the same time, we're going to put our knee on the neck of the people of Iran in the expectation that as they cannot breathe, they would kick and scream against their own government. The government that we ourselves claim that is brutish and is unresponsive to the people, right?
Yes.
So on the one side of our mouth, we're saying these are dictators. They don't care about their own people. They deny them rights and they don't listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we say.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we say that we're going to pressure the Iranian people to get their people to listen to them. So we are admitting that the way in which sanctions works is to pressure the people to do something about the regime.
Yes.
So we're passing the responsibility to the people. And we're not passing the responsibility by actually giving them a carrot, by giving them an incentive to do that. We're actually doing so by making them hurt,
mm-hmm.
by making them poorer. And then sanctions, it's not simply that the elite benefit. You see, what sanctions does is that it pushes a country's economy underground. It makes it securitizes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say if Iran cannot buy things through regular markets, I mean, just average consumer thing, it has to come through the black market, which is more expensive. But who controls the black market? The state, and more than the state, it's the security forces, right? It's just like any kind of an illicit trade around the world. It's men with guns who protect illicit trade. Mm-hmm. Illicit trade cannot happen without them. So the old Iranian middle class, as small as it was during Rouhani period, during earlier times, which was based on some kind of an independent private sector in Iran, has been replaced by a wealthy class in Iran, or a middle class in Iran, which is closely tied to the black market, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can go on Instagram, you can look, there are Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Bugattis in Tehran. There are spectacular apartments. There are incredible malls in Iran. There is a wealthy 1% class in Iran, right? And this 1% class, its wealth comes from business, but it comes from business that is essentially now dependent on the black market. So sanctions basically has changed the character of Iran's economy, the character of Iran's society, and the character of Iran's state in a way that is not going to snap back mm-hmm. if the sanctions were lifted. And particularly because sanctions are not like shooting a missile. It's not a one-time act that takes 2 hours to do. Mm-hmm. It's when it's imposed, it stays for a long period. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like if you cut yourself with a knife, it's a one-time act and you can repair it. But if you subject your body to certain kinds of chemicals, pressures over a prolonged period, it has an impact on your body that is not reversible easily.
Well, you have mentioned that sanctions actually shrinks or undermines the promoter of the democracies in the countries, the middle class. Mm-hmm. One might say that it might politically benefits the government because, specifically speaking, the authoritarian governments, because the promoter of democracies are losing their resources, they're shrinking that mm-hmm. class, and they're getting replaced. The owner of wealth, basically those who are, tied with the regime, affiliated with the regime. But evidently, people, the body of the population are getting poorer, mm-hmm. getting more dissatisfied, more prone to outrage, revolt. Mm-hmm. As we witnessed it in Iran, there's been a surge in a protests, in a violence on the street in the last 2 years. Even protests that have been not solely subjected to economic dissatisfaction, like the Mahsa Amini mm-hmm. movement, they've been fueled by it. And these protests at some point can go out of control. And the question is that a regime, specifically speaking ideological regimes like Iran, that they are survivalist by nature. Islamic Republic to the core believes that the protection of the regime is the highest and ultimate both moral and political priority. That's why Ayatollah Khomeini said that. Don't you think so that if the sanctions continues to press the people, push them to the edge that they might go after the very existence of their governments would, given their survivalist nature, at the end would try to compromise with the West?
That's the assumption here, but there's no evidence for it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm persuaded by that logic, When you say it, it makes sense. But
Yes.
but nothing in the case of Iran suggests that. They withstood the 2009 uprising,
Yes.
2018, 2019, and 2022. As serious as 2022 was, it didn't become a mass movement.
Yes.
And this is not about just Iran. It's that you have to sort of, if you broaden the aperture from Iran, if you look around the world, democracy movements have not been carried out by poor people. No. This myth that poverty causes an eruption that changes the regime, it's sort of a replaying the people's minds of the French Revolution of 18th century. It's not realistic. You look at every case of democratization or serious democratic movement, it's been led by the middle class, by wealthy people, where you have a private sector, right? Tunisia, Ukraine when they had a velvet revolution, Serbia, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia. None of these was because you had abject poverty and the poorest of the poor rose in rebellion for something better. If that was the case, we should be having revolutions not in these countries that were on an upward mobility, or middle-income countries with expanding middle class. We should be having democratic revolutions in the poorest countries of Africa and Asia, and that's not the case. And the logic is actually the following: that in Iran today, yes, there is a class of people who are wealthy, but 80% of Iranians now depend on the government for handouts. Every business in Iran now, because of the sanctions regime, is dependent on the Revolutionary Guards for its supply chain. The question we have to ask is not why angry young women, angry with hijab, angry with political crises, came to the streets. The question we have to ask is, why didn't their parents come? Why didn't the labor join them? Right?
Yes.
And the reason they didn't do it is because they don't have the stamina to do it. In 1979, an Iranian professor or journalist could go on months of strike against the Shah's government and eating out of his savings. Iranians now work 2-3 jobs. People are angry at the regime, but they don't have the ability to actually organize. Under sanctions, civil society has been shredded, both economically and because of security issues. Right? So yes, you can end up with a population that is extremely angry and unhappy, but can't do anything about it. Right? That was also true of Iraq. Sanctions in the end did not topple Saddam. An American invasion did.
Yes.
In fact, you could basically say sanctions eventually ended up in war. It was not a substitute for war. Had the United States gone to war with Iraq a decade sooner, it would have saved something of Iraq's middle class, which could have been a basis for a better future for Iraq than the one they got. By the time they arrived in Iraq, all Iraqis were poor. There was no middle class left. There was none of that lofty middle class of the 1980s left in Iraq. It was destroyed by sanctions. Iraq is not a country that could have supported democracy. And people in Iraq did not rise in rebellion against Saddam, as much pressure as we put on them. Even though there was a sectarian argument for it in Iraq, because the majority were Shia, the regime that was benefiting from, was doing well was Sunni. Still, people didn't have the stamina. So if you really want change in a country, you have to strengthen an independent middle class. That is a middle class that has disposable income, has the right values, and is not dependent on the government and the security forces for its economic well-being, has its own business.
Yes. Right?
That's much more Iran of the 2000. No, well, aside the 2000s of under Rafsanjani, under Khatami, under Rouhani. The Iran that we have today, basically, I don't see this happening in Iran, because we saw it in Mahsa Amini. Why is it that an extremely serious Mahsa Amini movement could not become a mass movement?
Yes.
Why didn't it draw 1 million people into the streets? Unless you do that, the regime is not under threat.
Well, you mentioned that they cannot lead to the toppling of the collapse of regime. And let's say that governments also know that. They feel that those who are running Tehran today, the Ayatollah Khamenei, and those who are looking at their neighborhood, looking what happened to Iraq, and they realize that sanctions cannot topple the country. poor people, they are either the fear of violence, which one might say that that's another difference between Islamic Republic and Shah, willingness to apply violence to extreme level, and also let's say that financial reliance or preventing people. So let's agree on this for the sake of the argument. But now the next question would be, so what's the end game? And you also mentioned that the sanctioner, the country that imposes the sanctions, it kind of sometimes does it either out of the hope that it might change. Sometimes it does it either out of, let's say, a self-gratification, as you said. Now I want to talk about the government that it is being sanctioned, the Islamic Republic's end game here. So what's the ultimate game here? Enduring sanctions, freezing the conflict, where they are heading?
Surviving the conflict, I think. I mean, countries can end up in prolonged periods of being locked into a strategy, right?
Yes.
That's true of the United States, as it's true of Iran. And the Iranians are now don't see a way out of this. And I explained, part of the problem here is not sanctions as a tool. The problem that we outline in this book is not that sanctions per se as a tool is good or bad. It's the way we use it that's a problem.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
It's, as I said, sanctions is like a knife, it's like a scalpel.
Yeah.
Scalpel is not good or bad. It's how you use a scalpel that's
Yeah.
the problem, right? So that's true of sanctions. The problem is sanctions never get lifted. It's a myth. But that's the way Iran sees it.
Yeah.
Right? So if you looked at long duration, they at one point agreed, for whatever reason, they agreed to go to the table with the United States. They signed the deal. Even while President Obama was in office, not everything that the United States promised was lifted, even though Iran fulfilled its obligations under the deal. But the United States held on to a lot of sanctions. Some sanctions were nuclear, and then they couldn't be lifted because there was also a financial sanctions on them. It's kind of like me saying to you, yes, now that you have a nuclear deal, you can buy cars, you can buy medicine, you can even buy aircraft, but you can't pay for it.
Yeah.
Because you're under financial sanctions, right? So there's other sets of sanctions. And then what Iran saw was the sanctions came back. So in effect, when you look at a decade, 15-year time period, let's say 2013 to 2023, 2024, sanctions never got lifted. Iran changed its behavior at one point. Sanctions didn't get lifted. Sanctions just keep increasing. Iran behaved better by signing a deal, observing the deal, dismantling its nuclear program. What was it agreed to? I'm not saying about things that we didn't negotiate with them, because that's a whole, a different way of you saying, yeah, this was good, but I really want to expand what was in the deal. But sanctions got increased. And when you look at Russia, you look at Cuba, for reasons of the way in which it works in the United States, sanctions don't get lifted. So countries basically, once sanctions arrive, they realize that unless the regime goes completely, you're a completely different country altogether, you're never going to get out of sanctions. So there is no incentive for actually changing route. Unless in Iran, the supreme leader says, let's pack all our bags, give the keys to somebody else altogether and leave. They know that under the Islamic Republic, the sanctions are not going to go away. So then the question becomes, how do we prepare ourselves for sanctions?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we have to construct an economy that is sanctions proof. We have to build missiles. We have to build our proxies to push against the US. And we have to actually, what they learned is that the only way in which you can get the United States' attention and negotiate is actually to become worse, not better.
Response pressure with the pressure.
Well, more than that. In other words, Iran, when its nuclear program first got revealed in 2003, in 2006, three European foreign ministers went to Iran and made a deal with Iran that it would shutter its program in exchange for economic sanctions relief. Yeah. The United States said, not interested. Iran decided that the US doesn't take Iran's nuclear program seriously. It doesn't have anything to negotiate with the United States.
Yeah.
So it went to the table in 2013 after the United States increased sanctions under Obama, but also after Iran got 119,000 centrifuges. The question is not why Iran came to the table. The question is, why did America go to the table? So the Iranians understood that basically, the only way you can control the escalation of sanctions is not by doing better, but is by doing worse. That's the incentive structure that is currently being built into sanctions.
Yes.
So before the Gaza war, in May of 2022, I believe, or maybe it was a little earlier, the United States had a secret meeting in Oman to arrive at a kind of a ceasefire with Iran.
Yes.
To keep things going until elections. Why did they do that? Because Iran revealed that it was enriching up to 84%, and he had amassed several hundred kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, which actually was not allowed to do under the nuclear deal.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's now only within 2-3 weeks of a breakout capacity. In other words, building enough fissile material for one bomb, and he has potentially enough fissile material to build a lot of bombs.
Yes.
And Iran abducted a tanker in the Gulf and killed an American shady Shia militias in Syria, attacked on a base and killed an American. So the US basically said, okay, what do you want to behave till 2025? The Iranians said, we need to sell more oil. And we need to we need to basically have you back off.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all the explanation and description. I want to wrap this question with wrap this discussion by a question that requires a little bit of imagination. Mm-hmm. Knowing what you know now, what you have discovered, you and your peers, the fact that sanctions most likely won't accomplish their ultimate goal, the change of behavior. And actually, they kind of defy their purpose. They push let's say, the target state to escalate this attention. Basically, one might say that sanctioned countries would obtain the Soviet approach, escalating their way out of the escalation. Mm-hmm. If you had this conversation with President Biden instead of me, what would be your recommendation to him?
So I would recommend policymakers, not just the president, but also all policymakers, to think about the broader ramifications of sanctions for U.S. foreign policy. Because in the short run, it's easy for them to say that, I have to do something, and this is the easiest thing to do. And it satisfies the critiques, it satisfies the public opinion. And then they may also be under some of the assumptions that we were discussing. They may think it works, they may think it produces results. But I would explain this to them. But I do think that it is time for the United States to actually sit back and really think about this. It's not just about Iran. The United States, since the turn of the century, has its use of sanctions has expanded by 900% across the world. It's sanctioning more countries, it's sanctioning more companies, it's sanctioning more individuals, and it's also using what we call now secondary sanctions. It's also sanctioning countries that do business with countries, right? And this is going to become more difficult because, first of all, it used to be just Iran, and now it's Russia and Iran, and China is actually gradually going under sanctions, and you sort of have now a bigger block of countries that are now in the same boat with the United States. And as this size of this collectivity gets bigger, sanctions are going to become less effective, because these countries are going to find ways to survive by helping one another. I mean, already Iran is providing Russia with varieties of sorts of products, as well as technology of how to survive sanctions, right? Yes. 30 years of experience,
exactly.
Right? And so you're now gradually going to have a landmass of Eurasia, which is one way or the other under this sort of sanctions. More and more countries are thinking about bartering with each other or doing trade that goes around a dollar. Right now, we're at the beginning of this, but the United States should take these as signs of overuse. Yes. The more you use something, the more prolifically you use it, the less effective it can become. Because first of all, not only because it's not working, but also you're building immunity. And the more countries you use it with, you create essentially a global economic bloc.
Yes.
that can basically give each one of those countries greater ability to survive sanctions. So sanctions effectiveness goes down. And then because sanctions stay a long time, you can't reverse this easily. Mm-hmm. Because once country builds economies around this, it's difficult to take back. My colleague Narges Bajogli has studied this, that now under sanctions and because of economic pressure, there's some 2 million Iranians, most of them single mothers, that basically have started varieties of kinds of businesses on their own out of their homes, for instance, providing makeup, clothing, catering, food, etc. Some of these actually fill the gap that has been left by importing things. They don't want to go back to an open economy. They don't benefit from it. And, the longer this stays, the longer, these become sort of the fabrics of Iran. And the longer this stays, the longer they actually will have a bigger market in Russia.
Yes.
And the Russian entrepreneurs will have a bigger market in Iran and in China, et cetera. So that's one thing that actually really behooves the United States to think about. It's not being nice to Iran. It's basically really stepping back and saying, this is really a dumb bomb. It's not a precision, instrument. The second is this issue that of ability to actually lift sanctions. If sanctions are basically a one-way tool and you cannot lift them, it takes away the United States' ability to negotiate really effectively. Because particularly after what Trump did with Iran, even under Obama, I think everybody around the world understood that when you go to negotiate with the United States over sanctions, they will ask you to do something which is pretty difficult, like dismantle a whole program, withdraw from a territory. But what the United States does is easily reversible, and it's not easy even to lift it. Even if the United States says, I want to lift these sanctions, it may take it 2 years to do so. And unless the United States looks at ways in which it can be much more nimble, it doesn't work. And the third, and this is very, very difficult to do, is, in an actual war, it's the president of the United States that can order a military strike. Like if they want to hit Iran or they want to hit some militia in Iraq, they don't even have to ask Congress about it.
Yeah.
And then they can say, okay, that's it. The Congress, even in a case of war, has to vote on war, but it doesn't necessarily vote on peace. And Congress actually is not in a position to vote that the United States goes to war. Congress cannot take the U.S. to war in that way, but it can on sanctions, they can. The Iran-Libya Sanctions Act was done by Congress, not the Clinton administration, one of the biggest packages against Iran. Congress can impose its own sanctions. It can prevent sanctions from being lifted. It can put pressure on the president not to lift sanctions. So sanctions is actually a sticky tool in the hands of the president, right?
Yes.
In other words, it's not a tool that he can really maneuver. And unless that changes, sanctions get sort of, is the one foreign policy tool which gets quickly locked up in a long-term way inside American politics. So Iran's enemies or adversaries or rivals basically don't bother necessarily with the administration. They work on Congress to prevent sanctions from being lifted, right?
Yes.
So if you impose sanctions on Iran and said, we want these sanctions for you to reduce your centrifuges, I don't know, from 10,000 to 1,000, Congress is in a position to say, yeah, but we want other things. And we're not going to let those be lifted. And if you lift it, we're going to vote our own sanctions to replace it. Right?
Yes.
So we have to think about these things. This is not about, and unless the United States fixes these things, it's being addicted to a foreign policy tool that is becoming increasingly problematic and counterproductive.
There must be a guarantee mechanism over there.
Well, that's actually what, in a way, sank the last round of nuclear talks with Iran in Vienna. Iran wanted some sort of guarantees. Maybe they were naive. The president couldn't and wouldn't give it.
Yes.
And if you can't and won't give it, then the other side has no incentive to sign.
Yeah. Dr. Vali Nasr, let me, on behalf of our school at the University of South Florida, our institute, Global National Security Institute, thank you. It was a pleasure to have you. And to you all, thank you for staying with us. And I want you to go to the description of this link and find a link to Dr. Vali Nasr's book. I'm sure that you will find it interesting. Thank you very much. Have a great day.